I hope you enjoy the book club. So tonight we will be covering only part of chapter 11. We're going to be covering the part that has to do with biblical scholarship during the Ramesside era. So the controversy that you have among biblical scholars is the fact that you have anachronistic references to Ramesses. And anachronistic is a big fancy word that means it's out of the proper chronology. So what we're going to investigate tonight is why a reference to Ramesses occurs in the book of Genesis outside of its normal scope and sequence. So I am going to go ahead and turn on the PowerPoint. Peggy and Cindy and Jeff and Horace, so glad all of you guys are here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on my PowerPoint. So you're going to lose me here. And as soon as I see that we're good to jump right into it tonight. We have had a film crew here this week, which has been fun. I've been able to meet some new people, and we've had some wonderful discussions. And so that's been lots of fun. So tonight we are going to be looking, as it says here, and let me see what's happening because my screen is not... Okay, sure. Hold on a minute. There we go. Okay. So the first document that we have regarding scribes during the Ramesside era is Papyrus Anastasia I. And this papyrus describes what a scribe was during the Ramesside era, but also because Devorah was contemporary with Ramesses, it would have been at the same time period. So this is what this Egyptian papyrus records. It says, the king's messenger must be a choice scribe and an able serviceman, leader of troops, head of the host, and listed in every office, a good charioteer and archer. You know, this really lists all aspects of the army, and this would seem to imply a broad range of literacy among Egypt's populace. If you have been following some of the excavations, the reports that I have been posting in the last couple of weeks, you will know that scholars have found documents from Ukraine that are in 3 different languages, date back about 3,000 years ago. So we're finding that the ancient world was a lot more literate than what we have more recently given credit for. There was another study done out of Israel that showed troops, Israelite troops at the time of Nebuchadnezzar and later in the Second Temple period were very literate as they among one another. And so this shows, again, a very broad scope of literacy among the general populace. So in regard to scribalship and the office of scribe, this was an office that was usually assigned specifically to the army. So whether it be history writing or whether it be issuing, it usually was a function within the army. The document that we're going to look at is not so much of a document as it is commentary. This is Donald Redford, and this is what he states on military scribes. His countryside military scribes were attached to each barracks, fort, and temple estate to keep local interest in the mustering of troops. When the call-up came, every company was assigned its own scribe. Scribes held the most important military rank. The scribe of the infantry was almost equal to the rank of general. So you find that scribes are attached to the military. Now this becomes very interesting within the context of Judges 5, as we will see. I do have a photo here. This is from the Old Kingdom Egypt, and this just shows you what it looked like during this period. During Deborah's day, you had Bethshan with a scribal within the land of Canaan during the 13th century BCE. So Israel's scribes probably would have been trained in Egyptian practices. Some of them may have been taken as hostages to the Egyptian court, given formal Egyptian training, and then returned to serve among the local city-states, either for Hatzor or for Israel's populaces under the suzerain treaties that they had during the day. So the scribes would have had their army. So now when we come to Judges, this is where we face an issue of translation. If you go by the KJV, even within the Masoretic text, there are some issues if you're going by the JPS as far as the word that is translated here as governors. So we're just going to read Judges 5, verses 14 through 15. This is what Deborah says regarding her scribes. It says, out of Ephraim, there was a root of them against Amalek. After you, Benjamin, among your people. Out of Machir came down governors, and this will be the word in question, governors. And out of Zebulun, them that handle the pen of the writer. And the princes of Issachar were with Deborah, even Issachar and also Barak. He was sent on foot into the valley. Now, Kolchak, translated governor, means to inscribe. So the family of Machir is really a family of scribes. We find that during the Joshua era, that Zebulun was established as one of the Levitical branches that housed the Levites that would write Israel's history and keep it up to date. So when you go back to the Judges record, and I have in the book on pages 578, 579, the different families from which these families came that were dispersed throughout the land of Israel, at least the land that they had occupied. Remember, at this point in time, Israel really had not conquered the entire territory of Israel. They were really focused in the Judean highlands, and it is only with Deborah that we begin to see this expansion into the lower valley regions. So Deborah tells us that scribes were with her. Why is this important? Well, you find, first of all, that Deborah's scribes reveal, they really allow us to pinpoint scribal authorship. So Deborah's scribes were observing contemporary protocol. They were archers, they were probably charioteers within the army that gathered with her when they began to war against Hatzor. And they would remain with the army throughout the monarchy. Now, specifically what I want to focus on tonight is the specific evidence for biblical history writing during the reign of Ramesses II. And the reason this is important is that it gives us a lens. The fact that we can pinpoint contemporary writing practices really allows us to identify when a particular phase of codifying Israel's historical documents, bringing them up to date, as well as perhaps writing some new history that had not been codified in some sort of state document had been done. So this is going to date right around 1258 BCE. Israel's scribes would have done this practice normally during a Jubilee year. So this would have occurred every 50 years for Israel. It just so happens that this Jubilee occurred within the reign or within the judgeship of Deborah. So one of the criticisms that I mentioned before is the fact that you have an anachronistic reference to Ramesses within the story of Joseph. It is just very out of place. So how do you account for a reference to Ramesses that is at least 215 years actually, and at this point, if we're going to take it during the time of Deborah, it's going to be closer to 415 years out of history? Well, if Deborah's scribes are bringing the records up to date, if they are making the information that Joshua and Moses had written some 250 years before, if they're making it relevant for their generation, if they are writing for the people of their day, they're not going to say that this occurred within the land of a pharaoh whom they do not know about. They're going to say that it occurred in the land of a pharaoh that they know. So during Devorah's time, it would have been the land of Ramesses. So it would have been very contemporary for them. The other thing that we find relevant to the discussion is in the biblical narrative, it states that Israel left from Pi-Ramses. Now, the moment scholars read the word Pi-Ramses and they read the word Ramses in scripture, they automatically want to hang everything that had any references to the Exodus on the Pharaoh Ramses. This is unfortunate because there's much more to the story. Devorah Scribes updated the documents, but it did not change that original history. And what that original history was is that there was another city called Alvarez. This was a Hyksos city that had lived at around 580 BCE, and it was destroyed when Moses chased the Hyksos out of Egypt. Shabbat Shalom, Stephen. So glad you're here. I'm not sure that I can change that with the widescreen. It was doing this last week as well. I'll get with the tech guy this week and see what we can do. So, but bear with me tonight, and if you want, I will send the PDF to you later in the week. So we find that with Alvarez is about 100 yards away from Pi-Ramses. And what happened with Pi-Ramses is that they simply took the building materials of one site and they reused it in the later city. It really saved on cost, and it provided monuments as well as stones that did not have to be recarved. And Ramses was able to build this city very, very quickly. But just because that reference is in scripture does not mean that is where Israel exodus from. It is simply a renaming of an older city, as we will see. The other method or another custom that Israel scribes used was to verify different sites within the biblical text. So it's fascinating because it appears that Israel scribes were not content to just read the stories in their own history that had been written perhaps by Joshua or Joshua's scribes. They actually, it appears, went out and verified the evidence that was written. So you find this phrase that occurs throughout the monarchy that states that a particular monument or a particular place or a particular artifact that is relevant to Israel's history is specifically verified as existing unto this day. So you have Rachel's, the pillar of Rachel's grave could be verified. You also have the place where Achan was stoned in the valley of Achor, that could be verified. You also have the children of Esau displacing another tribe that could be verified in the days of Moses. Then you go to, and I did not list this here, but you go to the verification of Moses's tomb. And it states that that tomb could not be verified because it states no man knows the place where he's buried. So you see a contrast a bit of those parts of Israel's history that could be verified by scribes versus those parts of Israel's history that could not be verified. So it's very interesting that that was even within the periphery of scholarship at this particular point in time, because you don't necessarily find this level of accountability and of accuracy within the works of scribes, say from Egypt or Mesopotamia. Now, we're going to be looking tonight also at Merneptah. At the end of Devorah's reign, you have Pharaoh Merneptah, who was Ramesses' aged son. Ramesses reigned for such a long period of time that he actually outlived most of his sons. Merneptah was the exception, and he came to the throne as a very aged man when his father died. And his reign begins at the end of Devorah's judgeship, and there is a transition where there's a time of oppression, and then you have Gideon. So Merneptah is right in that time period. Now, Merneptah himself, as a sole regent, only ruled for about 8 years. He may have had some co-regency with his father, but the only part that Egyptian scribes ascribe to him is a simple 8-year reign. Now, he left for us something that is very enduring and really helps us to understand this epoch in Israel's history. Now, this inscription usually goes by 2 names. The first is the Merneptah stele. The second is the Israelite stele. And the reason you have 2 names for it is that this is the first reference to a people called Israel that is recognized and accepted by almost every scholar today. This is why some scholars are very apt to place the Exodus in the 12th century, right around 1150 BCE, which is when many scholars place Merneptah's reign. So for most scholars, this marks a short period of time after Israel left Egypt, and now they are in Canaan some 40 years later. However, when we look at the genre of literature, when we look at the scribal practices between the Ramesside Era, which really lasted through the reign of Merneptah, we uncover some incredible similarities with Deborah's scribes, as well as the evidence that is left to us in the Merneptah stele. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. And I'm just going to draw some parallels before we get into some of the exact genres that are really specific between Deborah and between the Israelite stele. So first of all, the events that are recorded between Merneptah and Judges 5 and 6 are very telling. Both tell us that the highways are unsafe. Both tell us of widespread famine. This is probably where we can place the story of Ruth, at least the opening chapter of Ruth, where you have Naomi and you have Elimelech who are leaving Judea, and they are seeking to Moab for refuge from this famine. This is also the famine where we read that Pharaoh gave supplies to the Hittites in the north. So this was not a localized famine. This was very broad spread as far as reaching into the upper Levant. And of course, Egypt was not affected by this famine simply because they depended on the Nile, and they often escaped famine when Israel, modern day Turkey, Syria were affected by famine. So this is why you find the world kind of immigrating into Egypt, and then you have periods of instability in Egypt with this massive wave of immigrants that come into the land. So you have widespread famine. You also, Merneptah also tells us that hordes of nomads came up from the south and pillaged the desert. They pillaged Judea. Now, Merneptah does not mention Judea, but we know from Judges 6 that the Amalekites had come up during this time of famine. They had raided, they had taken the crops, whatever food stores Israel had, they had pillaged those due to this famine. And it's very interesting too, because in the Judges 6, it tells us that chariots were really of no use during this period of time, and that people resorted to caves and they hid in caves. So this is fascinating because it really is telling of this socio-economic situation where you have invading nomads from the south. You have a very unstable political situation. People cannot traverse the highways for fear of being robbed or molested. You also find that Merneptah attacks the places where these nomads had previously attacked. So Gezer comes under attack. Later, the Jezreel Valley comes under attack. And his whole entire purpose is to restore order, law and order to the land. And we will see next week, as we conclude our final class on the Canaan Conquest, we will see also that Merneptah does indeed attack Israel and perhaps Gideon, so that when we read the story of Gideon and the forces that he mounts with a simple 300 people, that this may be a attack against coalition forces, both localized as well as Egyptian forces. So we will look at that next week. The literary aspects of the Merneptah stele have some very specific convergence with Judges 5. You find that there is an allegorical lament, there is a curse of a city, and there is hyperbole. So we're going to look at these tonight because this really allows us to pinpoint the writing of Judges 5 somewhere around 1250 BCE at the upper limit, and somewhere around 1150, perhaps 1142 BCE at the lower limit, as far as when Devorah would have acted under her judgeship and ordered the codifying and the updating of Israel's archives. So this is some cogency that we see between the work perhaps of Israel's scribes and that of the Merneptah stele. In Judges 10:33, it is a summary, perhaps a colophon that would have been appended by Deborah's scribes, where it issues a summary, and this is what the text states. It says, "Then Horam, the king of Gezer, came up and to help Lachish, and Joshua smote him and his people until he had none of him left remaining." Now, it's interesting because you find that throughout throughout Joshua 10, as well as later in Joshua 13, you have these hyperbolic statements where it states that, you know, their seed is no more, they were totally wiped out, there were none left. And then all of a sudden, a few chapters later in the book of Judges, you find that these same people have rearmed themselves and they are warring with Israel again. So these phrases really have to be taken almost tongue-in-cheek to just realize that it denotes a widespread victory. It denotes a great accomplishment. It is not literal in the fact that the seed had been literally wiped out. We find the same thing with Merneptah's stele, where he euphorically states that he had wiped out the seed of the Israelites and that he had made the Horites widows. This does not mean that there were no more Israelites living within the land of Canaan after Merneptah's attack on Israel. Rather, it simply means that he had had a great victory and that Israel had lost some forces. So again, we see a parallel in the literary style. The other literary style that we find that we really don't find prior to this era or later to it is the allegorical lament. And this is where the monarch is standing and just visualizing the pain and suffering almost of their enemies. They are saying, you know, they're just envisioning this horrible loss that will be felt by the enemy. So for Deborah, it is Sisera talking about the mother looking out the window and crying through his ladders, saying, "Why is he so long in coming? Why does he tarry?" For Merneptah, his lament concerns Mary, who was a Libyan leader who had fomented a revolt against Egypt. So here, again, Merneptah states, when he reached his country, he was in laments. Every survivor in his land was loath to receive him. The chief to whom an evil fate has sworn of the feather, and a feather refers to the Philistine headdress. All of those of his town were saying about him. So here we have Mary returning to his hometown, not being received. They are lamenting his evil fate because he has lost the battle and he is not received as a warrior, but rather as that one who has been conquered. So you see a very similarity of literary style. The last thing that we're going to look at tonight is this curse of Meroz, or the curse of Meri, where both Devorah and Merneptah issue a curse for either a person or a city. For the Israelite context, the Hebrew context, it is vague to know whether it is an actual city or it is a person. The scholarly consensus tends to view this as a city. So in Judges it says, "Curse you, Meroz," said the angel or the messenger of Yehovah. "Curse you bitterly, the inhabitants thereof, because they came not to the help of Yehovah against the mighty." So you find that there was a city when Devorah and Barak mustered the forces. There was a city who was directly affected by the Egyptian ingress into Canaan and by Hatzor and by the entire political situation. And when Deborah mustered the troops, this one city either refused to supply provisions or they refused to supply garrison forces to help in this campaign. For Merneptah, he has a similar curse. Here it states, "The Lord of the Black Land has cursed his name, Mary, an abomination with the with-walled city," which is a reference to Memphis. So, you know, really at no other point in time in Egyptian history do we find this specific type of literary genre. Same thing for Israel. We do not find either in the prior Judges or Joshua Chronicles or history, or in the later history of Israel, we do not find this particular literary genre. So let's just recap some of the contemporary convergences between Deborah and Ramesses. First of all, we have references to Ramesses, and we know that Deborah lived at the same time. We find that other pharaohs are nameless. This was actually another practice during Ramesside Era, where pharaohs are not always referred to by name. They are just referred to with the generic pharaoh epitaph. Again, we find hyperbole, we find an allegorical lament, and then we have the curse of Meroz, which was perhaps a curse against a specific place. So all of this shows that Deborah's scribes were very contemporary with Egyptian scribes, and that the parts of Genesis, even parts of Deuteronomy, parts of Joshua and Judges, up until this point have been amended by Deborah and her scribes. So now once we get past Judges 6 and we go on through the records down into Saul and the monarchy, those are going to be the hands of a different set of scribes. Now, these would have been scribal schools. It's not as though these are independent scribes. These are scribes working underneath a government administration. So they have permission to codify the documents, and they are doing this as a matter of state, not really as a matter of religion. It's just a matter of preserving history of the tribe and of the people of the city-state. So this really concludes the study of the 5th conquest campaign. With Deborah, you find that it is the most advanced campaign in Israel's history to date. Israel came into the land in 1508, and really she doesn't see significant progress until the reign of Deborah. So from about from about 1275 all the way down to about 1230 BCE, you see this incredible destruction once again in Israel's history. Megiddo is set on fire. It is destroyed. Thek is destroyed with fire at this point in time. Hatzor, as we looked at last week, was destroyed. And then Beth-Shan was also destroyed at this particular time period. It's very interesting with Beth-Shan. We know there was a scribal school at this point in time. And one thing that is fascinating, when archaeologists went in and they began excavating the different stratum within within Beth-Shan, they discovered that, like and similar to Hatzor, that idols had been specifically targeted. They were smashed. Sometimes there were objects of gold that were destroyed, but they were not taken. So you find within Deborah's recount, she said that they did not follow the customs that their forefathers had. They did not issue the treaties and make the alliances that they had during the previous eras under Ehud and some of the other judges. Rather, they began to step out on their own to establish their own independence. And that's what we see, kind of this coming of age. Archaeologically, we find also that Israel begins to follow the instructions within Torah. We find that the burials during the reign of Devorah change. The interment is done in a very single manner. The grave goods are very simple. You don't find the types of interments that you do among Philistine or among the other Canaanite population. So that is one change that you see during this time. The other interesting change that you see during the reign of Devorah is that they stop eating pork and pig-related meals. So in Israelite communities, there are no pigs that are attested with any of their basically garbage that is disposed of. Rather, they really stick to the clean species when they have their meals within their communities. So this again shows a correspondence between what it accounts for in the Judges era, a time of obedience where Israel has independence, where Israel is granted autonomy. She is able to gain more land. And then, as we will see next week when we conclude the study of the conquest, we will see that Israel departs from the way that is given to them at Sinai. They revert back to some of their old habits, and then very quickly they are subjugated by the Amalekites, who come in and raid and destroy the land, who eat up their produce. And Israel really has to flee for their lives. We're also going to see next week the importance of how Israel, a vast majority of Israel's citizenry, never really built houses on Israel's land. Rather, they remained in tents, and they were very nomadic, which is difficult for an archaeological context when you have nomads who just move from place to place, don't really establish edifices that can be studied, but simply move, and then the desert really kind of covers over the places where they would have stayed. So this concludes tonight's class. Let me go ahead and exit out, and we are going to open it up for discussion. Any questions or comments that you all have, and it takes it a minute to come back. Again, the white light that you are seeing is that we are filming for a documentary on the Exodus, and it has been a wonderful week. It has been a tiring week. Cindy and I really covered a lot of territory in Washington last week, and I got to speak to a wonderful group in Yakima. And so I have been burning some midnight oil this week, just with everything that we have going on. And I keep your fingers crossed. There is another storm entering the Gulf. We're praying that it does not come this way. Otherwise, if the storm does come this way, we will likely see an interruption in the classes that we have on the weekly reading schedule, because we may have to evacuate. We'll just wait and see. We'll know something better closer probably to Monday or Tuesday of next week, once we get a gist as to which direction the storm is heading. Right now, the projection models do have it going between the tip of Florida and in Cuba, and really heading somewhere between Alabama and Houston. So that part is not looking good. Hopefully it won't materialize, but you know we go through this every summer, and just knowing the history, we know that there is that potential. So Cindy says that we logged almost 1,200 miles last week. Well, 1,200 for her and about 900 for me. Most of that, I believe, was sitting in I-5 traffic. To go about 150 miles, it really took us about 7 hours to travel 150 miles because the traffic was so bad. So the curse entity, so Betty asks, who did you say was cursed? For Devorah, she curses a city that it was called Meroz, For Merneptah, he curses a leader of the Libyans whose name was Marie. So you have two different entities. The names are very similar. I would love to see other scholars come in and study this further. You know, really a lot of what I am doing is laying the groundwork, and I'm hoping that other scholars will step in behind me and they will follow up with greater studies. Many scholars have access to documents firsthand at universities or museums that you don't always know exist unless you dig really, really deep. So I am hoping that that will occur. So any other questions before we call it a night? We are finishing a little bit early tonight. This kind of makes up for some of those other classes where we went over by a half hour, so you guys are getting a break this week. Next week, we will likely take the full class because we are going to go through Gideon. We're going to see the convergence of Jephthah and Samuel. We're going to also see the 7-year time period in the transition from Samuel to King Saul and the 26-year reign of King Saul and then to David. And then we're going to conclude with David. And then really David and Solomon are going to launch us into our transitional chapter, which will be the effacement judgment. We're going to look very closely at the command of Numbers 33, verses 50 through 55. This is a very key bedrock concept for ancient Israel's history, and also in the Second Temple period, the commands that were enjoined upon Israel for any time that she lived upon the land if she wanted peace. So we're going to look at that. We're also going to look at the extent of the Solomonic Empire and exactly what that entails. So I look forward to you guys joining me again next week. Any other questions? All right. If not, I'm going to go ahead and close the class down. Just so you know, a public service announcement. Ross is having class tomorrow, the first time in, I believe, about 2 months. So I hope all of you will join me tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. at Roots of Faith. And look forward to visiting with y'all again tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening and Shabbat Shalom.